Diablo 3 is one of those games that I play intermittently. It isn't like Devil May Cry 5, whose combination of challenge and spectacle combine to make this almost viscerally satisfying gameplay loop, and actively encourages players like myself to do better in the moment-to-moment combat through a style system and its directly related dynamic music. It isn't like Elden Ring, which feels like an expansion on the previous works of its developers to such an extensive degree that I find it hard to play those previous titles now. But as a direct result, I'm also finding it hard to play it itself now because I know I'll never have those feelings I had from my first original playthrough ever again. Diablo's gameplay is almost simplistic by its nature, almost admittedly doing a lot of heavy lifting there, and the only real satisfaction I feel and as a result garner if I'm doing any better comes in the form of the ever-increasing damage numbers. As satisfying though it is, it doesn't really feel solid, if that makes sense. It didn't really expand on Diablo 2's mechanics and gameplay to a degree that would make it hard for me to come back to either this title or its predecessors, and it's not nearly as memorable as a result of that issue when the change in presentation from Diablo 2 to this. Diablo 3 feels like a step, but not a step backwards or forwards, it's just a step to the side. At its core, it is a fun game, with some refinements of the dungeon crawler's mechanics that have spawned in the nearly a decade between Diablo 2 and Diablo 3, but there are some changes that defy what those dungeon crawlers have largely been known for as well. Enough changes that it's a game I have somewhat complicated feelings for. I don't hate it, but I don't love it either. There's a lot going on here, and it would be disingenuous of me to pretend that there isn't. Diablo 3 evidently started development in 2001 when Blizzard North was still around and was shown off at long last in 2008 in... wait, Paris? Really? Okay. It'd be another 4 years before Diablo 3 would release, though. Diablo 3, its Reaper of Souls expansion, and the Rise of the Necromancer Pack, released in May 2012, March 2014, and June 2017 respectively, was somehow the second Diablo game to release on consoles, despite being the third title in the series. Yeah, the original, as stated previously, came out on the PS1, and D3 came out on PC at first. Then it was further released onto the PS3 and Xbox 360 4 months later, PS4 and Xbox One 11 months after that, and then Switch in November of 2018. It also had multiple versions, depending on the ports and the time said port was released, surprisingly, the Ultimate Evil Edition and the later released Eternal Collection. Within the first 24 hours of its release, it sold over 3.5 million copies. Further rounding out the year is the best-selling PC game, with over 12 million copies sold. But this wasn't without problems. For a start, the development team, and thus the goals for the game over time, would change, understandable given that there was a decade between the beginning of development and the official release. The listed director for the game, Jay Wilson, first joined Blizzard in 2006. A relatively short time after Blizzard North closed its doors in 2005, and would remain as the director until 2013, when he was replaced by someone else, as Blizzard had him working on other things up until he left the games industry behind entirely in 2016. Interestingly, Blizzard had planned on making Diablo 3 originally into an MMO, which in turn, rumor has it, led David Brevik, the lead designer on both Diablo and Diablo 2, to jump ship. I have no real confirmation about that second part, but the first part, the MMO thing, that's a fact. Links below. Wilson was good at what he did. He worked with Monolith on Blood and was the lead designer for Relic Entertainment on Dawn of War. But he came in 5 years after D3's development apparently began. It's bad enough replacing anyone with that kind of timing. Much less so when it comes to the sequel of a game that was so internationally beloved, and much less so when the design philosophies of the game are apparently so different from its predecessors that the original lead designer, David Brevik, again on that game, would after its release state that as if it were a fact. To which Wilson would make the controversial comment, "fuck that loser," in response, which he would later apologize for. Obviously, this isn't the full context, and again, links below. My point here is that somewhere between 2001 and 2012 something changed, and it is noticeable, especially in...
Commander Calderos and his men were slaughtered at the gates. We are lost.
The most distinctly noticeable change between Diablo 2 and Diablo 3 are, of course, the visuals. There's still this air of grimness to the title, but the actual designs themselves seem almost cartoonish in nature. Look, I know that's an overused point to make, but it is true. I don't know if this was done to try and seem similar to the immensely successful World of Warcraft as some people seem to think or what, but it is visually noticeable, and I'm not talking about that whole "oh fuck, there's a rainbow now" situation that people were griping about on release either. I mean, the designs themselves. The cutscenes look fantastic though. I mentioned it before, they look really good. Matt Uelmen wasn't involved in the music though, which kills me a little bit inside. Instead they had Russell Brower. And like Wilson, Brower was good at what he did, but again, like Wilson, there was a reputation he had to effectively compete against. The soundtrack is fine, but I don't remember any of it off of the top of my head. I can remember the cutscenes. The characters, story details, the music though, not even a little bit. If I have to go back and listen to the soundtrack and have it pointed out to me where that song is from in the game, that's not good in my eyes. I mean, okay, I can't and don't expect every single song from any given game to be memorable to the extent that I can recognize it immediately, but not a single song across an entire game, especially a game that is an entry into a franchise that has been up until this point extremely well known for its stellar soundtrack. This is depressing. Making a theme or setting truly stand out relies on more than just saying, "Please don't take my leg," or "I can't see," both things that actually happen in the game.
Don't take my leg. Please, don't take my leg.
I can't see anything. Why is it so dark in here?
It's a combination of aspects that are supposed to combine to make this big picture, and the puzzle pieces here don't fit as much as I want them to. It's fine in the moment. It works. But when you put all those attributes together and think about them, like, properly, they don't really mix that well. They don't make a bigger picture that doesn't bleed into itself. The voice acting is good, and it helps that I'm constantly hearing Mr. Fantastic and Less whenever I'm playing as my two main characters. In fact, the sound design outside of the forgettable music is well done. Hearing those ceramic smashing sounds as you crash through the game's fairly varied environments is just a little bit of catharsis that combines with the sounds of your character using their weapons and the creature's guttural, I don't know what you'd call those sounds, but they're good.
This world can abide you no longer.
That was just a taste.
There's also a much bigger sense of scale than there is in Diablo 2. Take the Pandemonium Fortress, for example. In Diablo 2, it was just like 2 rooms, but here it's this multi-level dungeon area that acts as the final zone of the entire game, and the lead up to it, Pandemonium, as you'd guess, is this semi-sprawling battlefield with multiple buildings and areas of interest. The hubs for each act are still, small, but that's a Diablo hub for you. All that's there is all that's needed. Personally, I find the currently being ruined West March of Act 5 to be my favorite area of the game, with Grey Hollow Island being an admittedly close second. A nice feature, the variations of how items and loot appear on the ground. Each item has their own specific color, and some even drop with a unique sound and visual appearance to further set them apart and let you know that you're looking at Leoric's crown again for the 19th time. It's hard to miss especially interesting items when there's a glowing pillar shooting up into the sky to better locate them. They're also visually identified on the minimap with a little asterisk or a star depending on what it is. This is all nice.
Nephilim were not gods, but our own ancestors.
The Sanctuary, the world in which the Diablo series takes place, has seen better days. It's been 2 decades since the Primevals fell at the hands of the heroes of Diablo 2. You spotted a falling meteor in your travels and have elected to investigate it, and in these investigations you receive help from Leah, the somehow disbelieving niece of Deckard Cain, and continue trekking downward through the Tristram Cathedral and eventually discover that the meteor was in fact a dude, Tyrael, now mortal and warning sanctuary of the demons hoping to lay claim to it. 2 specifically, Azmodan and Belial. The story initially focuses on dealing with these 2 dark forces and has some fairly obvious twists as it goes on, but if I'm being honest, apart from the fantastic cutscenes, there isn't any one specific moment or character that I can remember that wasn't tied to the story. Again, the overarching story and details tied to that, yes, I've got that down, but everything outside of that, not so much. And to be fair, the story isn't a selling point for this game, so I can forgive that for the most part. There's one issue I do have, though. You, that is your character, don't really have that much agency. I mean, Diablo 2 also had this problem to a degree. It just feels much more prevalent now due to how the cutscenes work. I don't feel that important to the plot because I'm not in those plot-important cutscenes. Diablo 2 had cutscenes too, but they were mostly cutscenes framing events before the story or with events that the player character naturally wouldn't have been involved with to begin with. Diablo 3 has a lot of cutscenes where it would make a significant amount more sense for the player character to be involved. And there are these storybook-esque cutscenes that help frame the story more than the animated ones do and even flesh out your character's specific motivations and goals, but they feel wholly separate from the other cutscenes. They just feel detached, and it's much more noticeable as a result. I understand that this is likely an unfortunate side effect for having different characters, each with admittedly somewhat similar but distinct personalities and voices. This could and likely would have made this much more difficult to deal with, but it still feels off to me. The base game's ending also had an almost painfully obvious opening for a potential sequel and a much more painfully obvious hook for its DLC, but I find it interesting that the Reaper of Souls DLC's story, and most specifically its main antagonist, only really seem obvious after the fact. I can't go into too much of that because of spoilers, but it's interesting to consider that sprinkled into the various books you can find and information are given by various NPCs are these little nuggets and tidbits of information that, on a first playthrough or without the Reaper of Souls expansion, you might not even notice those threads that potentially tie it into the future sequel and current expansion, unless you're really looking for it. It's cool.
Vicious hounds roam the northern.
What's that? You want to know how the game works? Well, I mean, you kill things and take stuff off of the body of those you've killed. It's that simple. If you want it to be, anyway. The first thing to complicate that are the classes. Barbarian, Witch Doctor, Wizard, Monk, and Demon Hunter. Two more classes, the Crusader and the Necromancer, are found within DLC. Each of these classes are naturally different in terms of playstyle, but there's some changes from D2 to D3 that I don't really like. One big change is leveling up. The act itself doesn't require any input from the player at all. You don't allot either stat or skill points. Instead, each class automatically increases their attributes by a set amount based on the class, while abilities and skills automatically unlock as they level up. On the one hand, this vastly encourages experimentation, knowing that no ability lacks viability due to a misplaced stats and that there's no cost to use an ability to begin with is good. Having said that, it also makes a character potentially feel less unique, because of this lack of player involvement. A single character can do potentially anything and everything that another completely separate character with the same class can do, and the only real distinction between two characters of the same class is their gender and voices as a result. This gets compounded by the way that items work. There are a total of 20 different difficulties. The first 3, normal, hard, and expert, are available from the start. Master is unlocked upon leveling to 60 or beating the base game, and the torment difficulties similarly aren't available at all unless you've leveled the character to at least 60. The reason I bring difficulty up is because, firstly, it seems like an important thing to bring up. Secondly, it acts as a segue that probably could have been done better. And thirdly, because each increase in difficulty garners better rewards for the player, and venturing higher into the difficulties also unlocks new items and gear that can drop. Certain legendaries and set items can only drop from Torment 1 forward, and only if the character has met a level requirement depending on the item. While playing, you'll likely find a specific skill that you really like. Hopefully, there's a set that either focuses on or benefits from it. If not, there's still a set that makes up for that. In essence, you're working around the fact that there's no set as opposed to with that fact. Sets feel significantly more likely to be important than a legendary is, to the point where there is literally a set that exists because it's designed around the fact that maybe you don't want to use other sets. And thankfully, both sets and legendaries offer much more unique benefits than Diablo 2's equivalents did, and even come in stronger variants called Ancients and eventually Primal Ancients. The downside is that you only get these benefits as you equip more items from the set, limiting what items you can use, since each individual item doesn't have benefits specific to it as you equip more items from the set like in Diablo 2. Thus, limiting the mix and match vibes that items used to have, which in Diablo 3 is made even worse depending on the available sets for your character, since there's bound to be overlap depending on your class and again the set. Viable builds often feel much more limited as a direct result of these factors, at least going into the continually raising difficulties of greater rifts, which house the always important legendary gems. Runes and charms aren't around anymore, which I don't like. It's kind of a shame. There's still gems though, which thankfully stack this time, and perhaps more importantly, the aforementioned legendary gems. Legendary gems are mostly found at the end of a Greater Rift, a special location unlocked using a Greater Rift keystone dropped at the end of a Nephilim Rift and increase their level by way of Urshi, who's also found at the end of that same rift. These legendary gems are just as important as the rest of your build's gear, some of them even more so, literally making or breaking a build. So sets, legendaries, and legendary gems feel like the most important aspects of a build, even more important than your abilities and the base stat increases that your gear might give you, if I'm being honest. And because leveling doesn't really involve the player outside of their deciding to use a new unlocked skill or not, a single character in a class can utilize potentially any build, which, while nice for experimentation, also makes a character feel less unique again as a direct result. I've just realized I'm repeating myself, but it's too late, I'm already here. I don't feel the need to make a different character for a class I already have now unless I want to go through a season. But the problem there is that I don't feel compelled to do a season, since the big gimme for a season is a complete set that I can potentially get without spending nearly as much time with a different character that's already maxed out. I will, however, apologize for insinuating in my Path of Exile review that Diablo 3 seasons were just the same game again. They aren't, full stop, and I was wrong. I'm sorry. There are other things that can drop both in and out of season. These can include potions, keys, occasionally pets, and crafting items. This game's crafting isn't anything extensive, really. Well, mostly, but I don't expect a new player to immediately want something like the Staff of Herding within the first few minutes. These materials can affect a few things, those being mostly tied to your craftsmen, Hadric, Shen, and Miriam. You can't just build everything outright, or even build everything for that matter. For a start, you've got to give them recipes that teach them how to craft an item, and these can be dropped from certain enemies, dropped from caches, which are the rewards for clearing bounties, and some are automatically taught as you level them up. After a certain point though, only one of these individuals feels like they're really useful. Hadrid's craftables don't really help that much, and so I use him to disassemble items for their crafting materials after farming or whenever my inventory is full up. Shen, while more useful than Hadrid in allowing me to combine gems that can help depending on my build, eventually only gets used for removing gems and thus sees the same use as Hadrid does, mostly inventory clearing and not much else. Miriam though sees somewhat regular use with her ability to enchant, which replaces an existing modifier on an item with something else from a pool of available options depending on the modifier changed, at the cost of resources and gold. A big plus is that unlike Path of Exile, since I've already mentioned it I may as well do it again if only for comparison's sake, a new character doesn't have to start at the beginning of the campaign if it's something you have already beaten. A new character can jump right into Adventure Mode, a mode which houses among other things bounties, Nephilim rifts, and greater rifts, and spans across the varying locations found all throughout the game. It even has areas unique to it that can't be found in the campaign, which is what unique means. I'm repeating myself again, I'm really bad at this. Like the Realms of Fate and Grey Hollow Island. Unlike the campaign, however, the focus of Adventure Mode is its replayability. None of that matters if you can't play it though. I was bound to talk about this eventually. Diablo 2, while forcing the player to connect online, at least let you choose to play offline. There are some prerequisites, certainly, but you could still do it. Diablo 3? You'd better be on console because otherwise, no. Oh, what's that? You know, it can't be your rig since you're connected via an Ethernet cable and even those Wi-Fi connected items aren't having even a single issue? Sounds like a you problem, bitch. Technically, being online only on its own isn't that much of an issue from a strictly literal standpoint. When the game first launched, it had notorious problems tied to their servers, kind of like what Overwatch is dealing with now, most of which have since been resolved. Not Overwatch, though. But the game doesn't gain any benefits from being online only either. The only thing that benefits from this is the ability to play with other people, but that isn't necessarily something that would benefit from it being always online. Terraria, I don't need to be always online to play it, but I would need to be online to play it with someone else. All that being online garners for the game is the ability to play with other people in both Terraria and Diablo 3. The game feels at its core like a game with multiplayer as opposed to a multiplayer game, a distinction which I feel the need to point out. Always online isn't necessary for the game to function as a game. Also, there are still connectivity issues from time to time, and I know it's not my end. I haven't even covered everything in the game either. There's still the key wardens, uber bosses, the various secret levels, and even more various treasure goblins, the fact greater rifts can have higher difficulties that go beyond Torrent 16, Kanai's Cube, Paragon levels, Echoing Nightmare, Followers. I feel like they should have kept their names instead of constantly being referred to as Enchantress, Templar, and Rogue by the HUD in the game, but hey, what do I know? Transmogs, seasons, and seasonal events, which are two separate things by the way, season conquests tied to those aforementioned seasons, banners, Kadala and her gambling, the action combat mechanics, the no longer around auction house, the not explained in game outside of loading screens but now turned on by default and thus not worth properly bringing up anymore, elective mode. There's a lot going on, but they're not overwhelming since you come across these naturally as you play, to the point where once you have access to and are made aware of all of the game's systems, it feels like second nature. Act 4 is still disappointing though. Don't give me that it's a series tradition shit either. Something having a precedent doesn't make it right, or in this case, enjoyable. Alzheimer's has a precedent too, but I'm not keen on keeping that tradition around. Diablo 3 is an interesting title. It has an admittedly very slow start, especially in comparison to how it can eventually feel, but it's also a very nice feeling to see a character go from doing tens of damage to actual billions. The reliance on set and legendary items to make a character build makes those same characters feel somewhat less unique, but also offers an easy through line to follow to make sure a character is going the way that you want them to. Removing attribute and skill points also eases the player, freeing them from the potential worry of misplacing either kind of point, but again, like with how important set items are, also makes the player less involved, and thus grants a less unique character again. The environments are varied immensely, but the music isn't exactly memorable. The game itself, at its core, is fun, but it does change things from D2 to D3. Some are for the better, some are not. I recommend it, but don't expect me to sing its praises to the high heavens or anything like that. I enjoyed my time with it, and I'm likely going to continue to do so in the future, but I don't engage with it beyond the fundamental, yeah, I'm playing a game right now. Story out.